So which factions play nicest together, and which prefer to lone wolf it? Let's talk through every single army in 9th edition, what they provide well as allies, and who they might pair well with. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy-focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. In 8th edition, allies tended to be very commonplace, at least until Space Marines came out. Allied or super army lists seem to be the ways to go. In 9th edition, things are getting a bit more complicated, with single army faction buffs, and other incentives that Games Workshop are using to push us towards running armies as single factions where possible. Still though, I think a lot of armies work amazingly as allies, often it's still the strongest way to run them, and I thought in this video we'll go through each and every army, and talk about either how they might combine well with other factions, or just with different detachments within the same faction, for armies that can't ally out of factions such as certain Xenos ones. For allies within 40k, you're allowed to ally if you have the same super faction type keyword, so say all Imperial armies could ally together, as could all Chaos ones, or Eldari ones, and the forces of the Hive Mind too, and then the other Xenos factions are stuck with being just within their own codex, though they can fill different detachments within that army, say Orc players using Goths and Evil Sons as 2 different battalions. So in general, allies can be within the same codex, within different codexes, and there's plenty of options for just some single datasheet additions to an army, say for example Agents of the Imperium popping up in Imperial army lists, adding in something like an Inquisitor or an Assassin. There are obvious positives to using allies. It basically allows you to pick the very best units for the job, say for example combining hard-hitting Sanguinary Guard shock troops with Sisters of Battle hard-hitting anti-tank choices in Retributors, and maybe some really solid general-purpose long-range fire support from some AdMech. Generally each codex tends to have some standout units, and by allying you can take advantage of all of them. You can also cover an army's weakness, say for example Imperial Guard not having all that many melee troops, you could add in some really hard-hitting Space Marines for melee support, and you might be able to get your hands on other really useful things like psychic powers or stratagems that are spread over multiple codexes. Say for example, a Sisters Battalion could be really handy to include, as it gives you the access to that stratagem that gives you a 50-50 chance of denying any one psychic power. Certainly very handy for the army as a whole to have access to that option. In 8th edition there were next to no downsides to mixing and matching armies, but in 9th Games Workshop has tried to build quite a few. Firstly, if you're going to be running multiple battalions, you are going to be spending more command points to do so, and you might also be spending a bit more points on HQ characters that you might not have otherwise taken, sort of like a detachment tax. Say for example, if you did want to ally in some Retributors for Sisters, you'd have to get a Canoness or other HQ choice, even if you didn't really want one. As 9th rolls out, we're getting more and more codexes that have a single army advantage of some sort, say like Grey Knights getting their Tides to the Warp bonus when they're only Grey Knights in the army, Space Marines getting their combat doctrines, or Death Guard getting their Contagions of Nurgle. Some of these are really powerful, and it's a strong incentive that if you are running mostly that army, you may as well just bite the bullets and commit to having all of that army, so you don't miss out on the bulk of your forces getting a really powerful bonus. In addition, there might be a little bit less overall synergy. Say for example, if you do have your Sisters of Battle Canoness that you bought, she's only going to be able to buff the Retributors, not other units within the army that aren't Sisters. You're going to miss out on any faction-specific secondaries that you might be able to take, which are quite powerful in 9th edition, particularly for Space Marines. And finally, there are some limits as to when you can buy in Warlord traits and relics. They were quite de-restricted in the 8th edition codexes, but in 9th edition you can only buy in extra ones if your Warlord is actually from that faction. It means that you can't have an Imperial Guard Warlord, ally in some Space Marines, and then just spend command points to add Warlord traits and relics to the Space Marines anymore. Overall, the positives really are quite powerful, but there really are quite a lot of downsides as well, and I think that it certainly varies army to army and list to list whether it makes any sense to actually run allies or just run the faction as pure. With this all in mind, let's go through each and every army, talk about some pros and cons, and some likely pairings. So first up, let's start with the Space Marines. Generally they have quite a lot of reasons to run pure. They get their combat doctrines for extra AP if there are no other Imperial armies present, and they also get their own unique super combat doctrine on top of that, provided they're not mixed and matched with other chapters. They can only take Warlord traits and relics if the Warlord is a Space Marine. They've got their nice unique secondaries, including the Oaths of Moment, which is quite a powerful one to use. And on top of that, with Space Marines having quite so many options within their codex, it often means that they're quite self-sufficient and they can cover nearly any battlefield role within their own codex. It does mean out of allies you're slightly more incentivized to actually ally in other Space Marines as opposed to different Imperial armies. This will mean that you lose your super doctrine, but often that isn't actually the most important thing in the world. often gaining access to all the extra stratagems, certain unique units, and extra warlord traits and relics can outweigh the loss of the super doctrine across the army. I'd say the marine armies that like this the best are the ones where their super doctrine perhaps isn't the strongest, maybe armies like Imperial Fist and Raven Guard, where their super doctrines are certainly nice to have, but are maybe just a bit niche in the targets that they apply to. For other Imperial allies, it's not quite as positive. You'll lose all of your combat doctrines outright, so that's quite a significant loss in hitting power for the army with less AP, so you really need quite a good reason to add in something else. If you are losing combat doctrines, it kind of pays to have marines equipped with really quite high AP weapons, maybe units like Sanguinary Guard or Eradicators, where you don't really miss the extra AP that they would have got, as their weapons are really high AP anyway, and you're sort of getting into diminishing returns. If we go through a few Space Marine chapters now, let's talk about what they can bring to the table as allies and what they might combine well with. Ultramarines can bring the Seal of Oath for some really powerful localized fire support to delete one unit, and they can make their battle line quite flexible by redeploying a bunch of units, using a stratagem, and confound the enemy forces. They don't have all that much melee synergy, so they might work well with armies such as Blood Angels, Space Wolves, or White Scars. White Scars can bring some very long charges, great mobility to a Space Marine list, and generally have quite a powerful chapter tactic, but most of the time I think they're generally going to want to run pure, as their super doctrine is really quite powerful with +1 to their damage of their assault weapons, and that's not something that they really want to miss out on by allying. I think Iron Hands might be a bit of a better bet. If you're running vehicles, typically they'll be significantly better in Iron Hands. They can add one of their own character dreadnoughts that you can't target, so you could have some walking las cannons and missile launchers that just can walk around and not get shot, and you can make a very durable battle line by having all the Space Marines just get a 6+ feel no pain type save, and that can actually be quite good for objective holding units, say things like Incursors. They could perhaps provide a durable battle line and fire support for something a bit more adventurous that wants to be going into the midfield, whether that's Space Marines or something else in the Imperium. Raven Guard I think can work really well as a small contingent of allies to harness their most powerful tricks. With a Warlord trait you can infiltrate a really big hitting unit, say some Aggressors or something, and they can have pre-game movement on Vanguard veterans for a really nasty alpha strike. In addition, you can also have things like Assault Centurions coming out of Deep Strike later in the game, and that's another very powerful combo, as you can get round their slow mobility for their really nasty shooting and melee bonuses. You could even potentially double down on their alpha strike with some other fast and aggressive armies such as White Scars or Blood Angels to give you some other options. Next we have Salamanders, who I think typically don't want to be allies quite as much. A lot of their raw strength comes from the +1 to wound buff that they get on Melters and Flamers that comes from their own unique tactical doctrine. They could certainly provide a little bit of extra raw strength to an army with their nice general purpose stratagems, but I think that on the whole if you're taking a significant amount of Salamanders, it generally makes sense to run them without allies. Finally, for the less divergent chapters, we have Imperial and Crimson Fist. While they're arguably not one of the strongest chapters at the moment, I could again see them being a fairly decent choice for a solid backfield gunline. Maybe a bunch of troops with some really efficient bolter fire, buffed by a character with the Eye of Hypnoth. Again, like Iron Hands, I think they could do very well being the firepower contingent of a list, maybe pairing well with something a lot more aggressive like Blood Angels maybe. Moving on to the more divergent Space Marine chapters now. I think that Blood Angels are a chapter that work really well as allies, and could work great for adding in some really dedicated assault muscle to an Imperial force. A fighty character and a few units of Sanguinary Guard are very hard to go wrong with, and a lot of their strength comes from their chapter tactic as opposed to any other options. Could work well for some shock assault type units for an army like Guard, Admech, or maybe some of the other ranged Space Marines that we've talked about here. Space Wolves I'd say are in a fairly similar boat to Blood Angels, though perhaps out of the assault armies I would prefer to ally in Blood Angels over Space Wolves. Space Wolves are a bit more well rounded as an army I feel, and a lot of their power comes from their characters, army synergy and stratagems. They're certainly handy enough in a scrap though. Dark Angels are one of the strongest armies in the game right now. Their Deathwing Terminators and their Ravenwing Bike and Attack Bikes are all insanely strong, tougher than the vast majority of other Space Marine options, and also can get a very generous amount of OBSEC. Dark Angels are certainly one of the armies to beat at the moment, and I don't think they tend to be allied all that much, as they can generally fulfill all battlefield roles very well themselves. I guess if you just want to add a bit more teeth and raw power to an army, I think it would be hard to go too far wrong with throwing in more Deathwing Terminators or Ravenwing Attack Bikes. They are likely to be similarly efficient if not better than many of the choices in other codexes. Deathwatch I feel can make okay allies as an army with a few specific tricks. You could bring a core of Redemptor Dreadnoughts with a 5+ invul save from their Relic Shield, maybe have a squad to use the Beacon Angelis on to jump someone into the midfield, and perhaps get your hands on a deep striking kill team or two. I feel like they could be good options for allies as you kind of get into diminishing returns for them. Quite powerful when they're using their best tricks, but other battlefield roles they might be a bit more lackluster for. Finally, for the more out there Space Marine chapters, we have Black Templars, who again I feel similar to Deathwatch have a fair few of their own unique special tricks, things like their 5+ Feel No Pain litany, advancing on charging on one unit, and Devout Push, all of which can only be done on one unit per turn. Though I must admit losing their unique assault doctrine early isn't great, as they can get easy access to that on one unit with their Crusader helm. I guess they might pair well with a ranged contingent in theory, though the majority of successful Black Templars lists that I've seen do seem to be run pure. Moving on to the Demon Hunters, the Grey Knights are one of the main armies that you really want to run on their own, as their Tides of the Warp buff is just so powerful. Getting the Tide of Shadows to make a massive durability buff across your whole army is really nice, and they can potentially switch to their Smite buff if they need a little bit more mortal wound output. They also tend to be quite heavy on the psychic power synergy across units, so I feel like if you have quite a lot of units, then you have a lot of options for who to buff with psychic powers and different options for casting. In general, for what they could bring to the table as allies, plenty of strength 4 shooting with Stormbolters, big blobs of Terminators or Paladins with big buffs stacked on them, and some decent melee in Dread Knights and a few teleporting shenanigans such as Interceptors. Perhaps as quite an elite army, they might have some use for some small units for actions or screening, and perhaps a bit more efficient long-range firepower, as for the most part their units tend to be at least fairly close range. If you are breaking their Tides of the Warp, I feel like they might pair fairly well with one of the less elite Imperium factions, maybe Admech, Guard, or Sisters. Next up we have the forces of the Astra Militarum, and as it stands with an 8th edition codex, Guard have no special reasons to run as a pure army, so allies are going to be extra viable for them. If you were to include a small contingent of Guard, they can really offer quite a few things. Demolisher tank commanders are very efficient anti-tank, they can have some of the best Imperial artillery with full payload manticores. Infantry squads and chimeras and the move order can be good for securing midfield objectives with harder units, and it can be quite helpful for an Imperial army to actually be able to bring a horde element which we don't have any other option for aside from Guard. In more recent developments, the very durable Death Riders of Krieg can provide an excellent screening force, and with their newer cheaper points cost, Bulgren squads are looking more tempting than ever, as a cheap and durable assault force that can hold down the midfield. In terms of what they can gain, I think that Guard can gain quite a lot from allying in multiple detachments of Guard themselves, maybe taking one of the custom regiments for all of the tanks, the ones that get the regenerating wounds or re-rolling number of shots, and maybe having Deathcore of Krieg for some riders or Kaschan for some fairly burly melee capable infantry. In general though, Guard melee is really limited at best. I think they pair really well with anything that can absolutely tear things up in melee. Maybe if it's some Blood Angels shock troops, Sisters of Battle Repentia and Rhinos, Admech Fulgurite Electro Priests, or maybe even Imperial Knights. Having a good mix of melee and range is really important in 9th edition, and I think that is one way that Guard can benefit. Next up we have the Adeptus Mechanicus and the forces of the Machine God. Currently, again, there aren't any specific rules for them to want to run pure, though I strongly suspect that this will change with the drop of the Admech Codex, and they'll only be getting the Canticles of the Omnissiah if they're only an Admech force. Perhaps the biggest disincentive against mixing Forge Worlds are those Forge World specific Canticles, which if you activate one of those, it'll only affect the units out of one given Forge World. In general, for what they bring to the table, they certainly have some cross-faction synergy. Their Tech Priests can heal knights and other Imperial vehicles. They can have some insanely strong shooting, particularly between their good units and really powerful buffing characters, and currently they have some absolute god tier screening with their Cerberus Raiders. They're certainly units that have the potential to swing a game all by themselves. They've also got one of the best backfield units in the game in my opinion, Cataphron Breachers with the custom Data Horde Forge World trait that gives them amazing buffs to their arc rifles. They have 3 toughness 5 wounds, really good generalist firepower, and they're also obsec and have some close combat ability on top of that. Finally, having a Fuselav winging around, dropping mortal wound bombs and slowing down enemy units is also a pretty nice tool to bring to the table. In general, they're a fairly strong army, they don't have all that many melee options, and perhaps they could use things that could hold down the midfield, some very durable units that are quite dangerous in melee. For good pairings, Imperial Knights do have a lot of synergy with them. You can use Knight of the Cog, and that can get even more efficient if you're running Metallica and Raven together, as per the new rules in that Charadon campaign book. I think they can be really quite powerful to run multiple Forge Worlds in the same list. Say you can have Stygies Dune Riders full of Fulgurite Priests, and they get the pre-game move, and then combine that maybe with a Mars or custom Forge World gunline. Otherwise, I think other strong melee armies such as Marines, maybe adding in some durable intercessors or Blade Guard veterans to storm into the midfield, might be something to fill that niche for the AdMech. Next up we have the Sisters of Battle, and their main incentive to run pure is their Sacred Right special rule. That's the one where you pick one of 6 buffs pre-game, for example a boost to combat or their charge rolls, and you either get to pick 1 buff or roll for 2. I'd say they're a nice to have, but are hardly essential for the Sisters list. Perhaps you're most pressured to take them if you're running a very melee-focused Sisters force, as I think the melee ones are stronger. For what the Sisters can bring to the table, they've got quite a well-rounded army that could easily be your core battle line, have some really powerful damage dealers in units like Retributors with multi-melters or Repentia squads jumping out of Rhinos, the potential for some really scary anti-horde damage dealing units in Mortifiers, and that nice Psychic Test denial stratagem that you can deny a power on the roll of a 4+. As for what they could use, maybe a few different options in firepower would be good. Multi-melters and heavy bolters are great and everything, but sometimes you might want to have access to other options such as autocannons maybe. Again, some really tough units to hold down the centre of the board wouldn't be too bad. The Sisters can be fairly durable, but most of them are toughness 3. Similar to the AdMech, I think units like Space Marine Blade Guard or Guard Borgrins or Death Riders could actually help them out quite a bit, and give the enemy something to chew on while the damage dealing units of the Sisters get to work. Next up we have Imperial Knights, who again don't have any army-wide rules to encourage them to run pure, though I'd say they are quite good to run as your Warlord due to the massive CP savings that you get for the super heavy detachment. The main thing that you're getting from Knights is raw power, very intimidating big units, with devastating firepower, and are all at least pretty capable against kicking things over in close combat. If you're running a lot of big, heavy armoured threats, then Imperial Knights can go well with this as well, and further stretch your opponent's anti-tank capabilities. However, they do bring their own issues as well, such as giving up the Titan Slayer's secondary objective quite easily, and they don't interact with terrain very well and aren't very good at scoring objectives. Basically, cheap infantry units of some fashion will typically help them out a lot. They just need things to fill the roles of taking objectives, screening, doing actions, using terrain to better advantage, and potentially deep striking. I think typically they'll pair better with again the less elite Imperial factions, things like AdMech as we've already mentioned. A few units of Rangers or Vanguard could do a lot of work, plus the Priest can help repair them, and guard infantry squads with move, jumping all over objectives, and they can also provide a bit more armour saturation in their artillery and tank commanders. Finally, Sisters might be worth a look as well, for their fairly cheap infantry and some anti-psyker defence. Finally, for the main Imperial factions, we come to the Adeptus Custodes. Again, they don't have any whole army-wide buffs yet, though if you are running a detachment of them, even just meeting the basic requirements of 1 HQ and 1 troops choice is fairly expensive already. If you just want a few units of Custodes, compared with a lot of other factions, the basic tax units to get them are really quite high. In general, I think this usually means that they're the main faction in an allied pair, maybe with a smaller contingent of something else to help back them up and cover weaknesses. As for what they bring, they're a really strong force in 40k at the moment. Their units are pretty hard to kill with good melee, they have Obsec over the whole army, fairly good support units with Forge World firepower models, and Sisters of Silence that can provide a little bit of psychic defense and maybe do a bit more grunt work. As quite an elite army, I think they mainly profit from some cheap mobile chaff units, and maybe a little bit more dedicated anti-tank firepower, perhaps bringing in some really efficient melter weapons from Sisters or Space Marines. In particular, I've seen a fair few people run Tempestus Scions with Custodes. They do seem like really quite a good fit, a few very cheap units, maybe with some hard-hitting melter weapons, dropping in areas that the relatively slow Custodes might struggle to reach to. Lastly, we come to the Agents of the Imperium, basically all the choices that you can just add into an Imperial army list: Inquisitors, Assassins, and Ephrael Stern. Their army roster isn't big enough to run pure with the current rules, though you can include an Inquisition detachment, though it seems to be quite a rare include due to the command point cost. I think that the various units in the Acolytes, Jakiro, and Demon hosts are kind of okay to run, but maybe just don't justify the CP buy-in. Inquisitors can bring some interesting psychic support to various Imperial armies. They do have psychic powers that work on any Imperium units, such as the Ordo Malleus one that gives a unit a 5+ invul save, very nice for a big blob of guard conscripts, or even plenty of units in power armor. It can also make enemy units unable to overwatch, which can be quite nice with some fragile melee troops. They can also provide a leadership bubble for a leadership 9 or 10 battle line, very relevant for armies such as Guard or some AdMech units. Add in a little bit of psychic denial, which is even better with Inquisitor Greyfax, and the ability to make an enemy fight last with Kyria Draxus. In general, I'd say that Inquisitors tend to see some fairly niche use, but certainly aren't commonplace. Generally, I think they're at least fairly low yield in terms of the return for the character buff, and a lot of the time you might just be better investing in more battle line units, or actual units with the codex that tend to have more synergies. The assassins again tend to be a bit more of a fun and fluffy choice as opposed to hyper competitive these days. They're not terrible, but I think they kind of struggle to justify 100 points of your list. Vindicares obviously do sniping fairly well. The Calidus can be somewhat annoying with causing command points to cost more. The Calexus can give you some dedicated anti-psyker, and the Eversaw can be a bit of a pop-up anti-infantry blender if you do need an anti-horde tool. You can spend 2 command points to flex the assassin based on the opponent's army, but again that really is quite a steep option at 2 CP, so it certainly has its trade-offs. Finally we have Ephrael Stern, who's basically an okay damage dealer, maybe a bit better against chaos, but still fairly fragile. All of these are very easy to include in any Imperial army list. You can just slot one into the detachment, and it doesn't break any army-wide special rules. If any of them suddenly get good for any reason, it will be very easy to include them, but I think the vast majority of them are somewhat inefficient at the moment. So now we move away from the Imperium and into the realm of Chaos. First up we have the Chaos Space Marines, who again don't have any specific reason to run pure, but again depending on exactly how you're building the Chaos Space Marine list, they do have quite a lot of synergies within the faction, and perhaps work best with multiple buffing characters, or stacking their buffs on a really big damage dealing unit, such as perhaps Possessed, Obliterators, or Noise Marines. They can bring Sorcerers with Warp Time and Prescience, which can affect other Heretic Astartes units outside their codex, and they can have some overlapping synergy with other Chaos armies, such as lots of interesting and useful interactions with the Chaos God keywords such as Nurgle or Slanesh, or the Demon keyword, which quite a lot of Chaos Space Marine units have. Each of their legions has its own tricks, which we'll go through in a second. Helldrakes can be an interesting disruptive melee unit, jumping across the other side of the board and annoying the enemy, and as I mentioned they can really bring some big synergy Death Star types units, like the ones we've already mentioned, or the Chaos Terminators with Lightning Claws and Combi Bolters. For what they might look for in allies, maybe a bit more raw power, things like big Greater Demons or Chaos Knights, things that can provide a lot of damage and hard-hitting things without being reliant on stacking buffs, and potentially armies like Demons or Thousand Suns can provide buffs to certain Chaos units. If we go through the individual legions, Iron Warriors are a good choice for an allied detachment of tanks or firepower units. They can really soup up some of the demon engines as well with their stratagems. World Eaters are a pretty reasonable choice just for raw melee damage and their Red Butcher Terminators. Word Bearers could bring a scary core of possessed or demon engine units, all built around a Master of Possession with many of their unique traits. Alpha Legion can bring quite a lot of utility as a ranged gun line. Their stratagems to intercept things, hiding units when they're in plain sight, and auto-exploding enemy vehicles are all very fun and disruptive. Emperor's Children seem to be one of the best ways to go at the moment for these big hitting melee damage dealer units. Stack delightful agonies with a few of their other buffing characters on one unit and let them tear the enemy to pieces. Night Lords can do some leadership shenanigans if that's your thing, and bring the very powerful stratagem Vox Scream to shut down some enemy auras. And Black Legion might be a fairly decent core, with Abaddon himself and maybe leading some Terminators into the fray. A couple of the warbands are really quite solid as well, such as the Flawless Host giving some very fighty Lord Discordance, and the Purge Legion trait can combine quite nicely with Shooty Forge World Dreadnoughts. Next we have the Chaos Space Marines that got sick. The Death Guard being one of the few armies with a 9th edition codex really have good reasons to run them pure now. The Contagions of Nurgle ability giving a big -1 toughness aura is really quite painful to give up, and if your army is mainly Death Guard, it's likely you're going to want it to be entirely Death Guard so as not to lose this. They may be better added to another Chaos list in small numbers just to give some raw power. What they can bring is some very durable units to hold the battle line, Terminators, Demon Engines, and cheap chaff Poxwalkers. Some very hefty melee threats when units like Plague Marines, Death Shroud, and Mortarion himself, and a few interesting mortal wound mechanics and debuffing psychic powers. They tend to be fairly slow as a faction, so could certainly use a little bit of extra mobility to help them out, and maybe just a few more hard-hitting, devastating units that can move fast and hit the enemy really hard until it stops moving. You can potentially make some interesting lists with Epidemius to give some Demon Engine buffs. Maybe think about adding in Mortarion to some sort of Chaos Monster Mash style list, maybe alongside Magnus or some Keepers of Secrets, as Mortarion is easily good enough by himself, even if he's not supporting the rest of his codex. Next we have the Thousand Suns, who again don't have any whole faction buffs, and they're an army that I've very rarely ever seen pure in competitive army lists. They're almost always allied at the moment. I think they can be a really powerful addition to an army in small numbers. They can provide some really strong psychic support, particularly with Araman, some Risen Rubricae, and maybe use the Dark Matter Crystal to port a unit across the board, which can be quite a powerful threat. They can of course bring Magnus himself, who can be very hard to deal with once he gets his durability buffs up, but I think they'll just struggle when they're run all on their own as a whole faction. Their units just aren't massively efficient in terms of just straight up giving and receiving damage. For that reason, I think they usually will tend to be run as a smaller partnership in a greater Chaos alliance. Demons can provide them some excellent screening and heavy hitting with the greater demon. You could just literally use them with Magnus and no one else in that Monster Mash Chaos style list. And if you are trying to run pure Thousand Suns, I think it does make sense to run multiple different detachments. Then you can benefit a bit better from the different cults of magic, such as the Cult of Duplicity. Overall, pretty much one of the factions that most wants to be allied with other ones. Next we come to the Chaos Demons, and again they don't have any whole faction buff, which means that you really want to run the entire army as pure, but they do get some specific buffs if you manage to separate the 4 gods into their own different detachments, some of which are important and some of which are less so. I think the Locust benefits for Nurgle and Tzeentch aren't particularly outstanding, but the Slaanesh ones really want to be in a pure Slaanesh detachment, as it means they get to advance and charge. Chaos Demons really can bring a whole toolbox of tricks to a Chaos list. The Exalted Greater Demons, particularly Keepers of Secrets and the Lord of Change, are really powerful. Nurglings are a really solid screening unit, being able to set up in the midfield and being quite durable point for point. Fiends can automatically lock the opponents in combat and stop them falling back. Beasts of Nurgle can be really tough, annoying units to soak up. You can have deep strike infantry units jump in to deal a lot of damage, such as Bloodletters, Horrors or Flamers. And as we mentioned, they have some psychic powers and abilities that can affect demons or god-specific keywords. In general, Chaos Demons are quite a strong army at the moment. If you do want to have any sort of good range fire support though, that is generally something that you could think about allying in, or try and overload the enemies with monsters, as we've said. The Exalted Greater Demons are good, but I think you get into diminishing returns after a while, so other strong options like Magnus, Mortarion or Chaos Knights can really add to the variety there. Otherwise you could think about a bit of fire support from Chaos Space Marines, or maybe even Death Guard Demon Engines. I think that Chaos Demons are an army that works at least fairly well on its own, but allies very well as well. Finally, for the Servants of the Dark Gods, we come to the Chaos Knights, and in general they're in a very similar position to the Imperial ones. They bring some solid raw damage and durability, particularly their Armiger War Dogs, which can hit very hard in Iconoclast when combined with certain household traits. They also have quite an interesting ability to remove invols in close combat with a cornate target. It has the potential to turn a very durable unit into one that's fairly easy to kill. Much like Imperial Knights, they definitely have their downsides, easy to give up secondaries, and need support for things like screening, objective scorings and actions. I think Chaos more than Imperium can add in other very big hitters, things like Magnus, Mortarion, Greater Demons and friends. So you've got multiple fast-moving, very hard-hitting threats, maybe backed up by a bare minimum of Poxwalkers, Nurglings, Beasts of Nurgle, or things like that, just to hold down a few objectives and prevent the army from completely getting outscored. Now we move into the world of Xenos, starting with the Craftworld Eldar. Again, there's no army-wide reason to run them pure, but certain spells do encourage you that way a little bit. Things like Doom and Jinx can really let your entire army just go to town on one unit, but they only work if the units that are attacking them are Craftworld Eldar units also. Generally they are struggling just a little bit in 9th edition, certainly not one of the strongest factions. They can bring some nice movement and redeployment tricks though, things like Quickening and their stratagem that they can use pre-game. Their custom Craftworld traits are really quite strong as well. They can combine multiple rerolls with ignoring cover, and also have some other things for buffing Wraith units or melee. They can bring some powerful and reliable psychic powers, and some fairly decent long-range fire support for Eldar, and perhaps a bomb of Guardians coming out of the webway with shuriken weapons. Perhaps not so unexpectedly for Eldar, they do struggle with just some either expendable or raw durability units to hold the middle of the board and take the objectives, and in general just some raw power that either Drukhari or Harlequins could potentially provide. If you are running craft worlds, it's very easy to run them in multiple custom craft worlds, maybe one with shooting with masterful shots and expert crafters, and maybe paired with something a bit more wraith or melee focused for your forward advancing units. Otherwise, Harlequins can just give them some nice raw strength and trickiness. Skyweavers or Starweavers full of fusion pistols are hard to go too far wrong with, and Drukhari could potentially have a few units to solve the going forward problem, either just jumping a ton of expendable units onto objectives, or bringing in some all-out melee threats, things like big witch units, Hellions or Reavers. If we talk about the Dark Kin though, they now have a very powerful reason to want to go pure, as they don't get the power from pain bonus for their 6+ invul save and their advance and charging if they bring along Craftworld or Harlequin allies. I would say that power from pain is perhaps more useful on certain units than others though. The more shooting orientated Drukhari don't care about it as much, but anything that's wanting to get into really likes that advance and charge option. Also, if you go pure, you get access to their army construction rules, such as their multiple patrol thing or the real space raid, and they also especially don't interact well with the Inari characters joining them either, as they can join Craftworlds and Harlequins quite freely, but break power from pain if they're added to Drukhari. Generally though, if you're adding in a small amount of them to one of the other Eldar factions, they can really bring a lot. For not all that much investment, you can get some serious hefty melee power. If you do make the faction your warlord, then you can get warlord traits and relics on them that are really very potent. They have enormous speed with things like Reavers, Hellions, or their transports, decent anti-tank in the dark light weapons, particularly those dark lancers on raiders, and the interesting option of poison weapons, which can be really strong against certain high toughness targets such as greater demons. I think in general their army is really quite well rounded at the moment. They don't really desperately need allies all that much. I guess a little bit of psychic defense couldn't hurt though. I find Drukhari an interesting one, as they're practically designed as a faction to be their own in-codex allies with their Coven, Cabal and Cult units. Between their patrol rule and real space raid, you pretty much get the benefit of allies just built into the Drukhari codex as standard, as you can tailor the different obsessions to what you really need. I think if you are running them as allies though, you're unlikely to want to only ally a small amount of another faction in, as then you lose power from pain. I think you're more likely to add in a small amount of hard-hitting units to either Craftworlds or Harlequins. Talking of which, the Harlequins also don't have any 4 army rules to go pure yet, though having so many fast-moving units that work in the same way and can deal with virtually any threat really is quite nice. I say I've managed to copy and paste the what can they bring from the Drukhari section, so feel free to ignore that, but in general Harlequins have been all round strong since the start of 9th edition. Fast hard-hitting units in their boats full of fusion blasters, or their sky weavers with haywires and zephyrglaives, plus some incredibly annoying stratagems and solid buffing characters. Just having a few units to be able to deploy their very best tricks, such as being able to charge and then just run away before they're hit back, could be a really nice thing to do. Of course the Harlequin range is very limited indeed. They don't really have any long-range fire support that's any good, and they don't have any units that are really all that durable when they're right up close with the enemy and exposed to maximum return fire. Any of that would be pretty helpful, plus maybe some cheap objective campers or units to score objectives, which if you're using troops for that, then you're kind of paying through the nose. Harlequins do seem to combine quite well with any of the other flavours of Eldar. I've seen a fair few lists out there that add in the Incarn. Having a massive melee threat pop up when a unit dies is pretty disturbing, and could definitely add another dimension to the list to leave the enemy guessing even more as to the position of your forces. Craftworlds can give some good generalised fire support with that expert crafters and masterful shots, particularly combined with some Forge World units, and Drukhari can maybe bring a few more cheap and more expendable units, quite good for holding down objectives, or maybe just sending in a unit to its death that you know is pretty much going to die. Overall though, I think that Harlequins can be very strong on their own. In terms of competitive lists, I'd say about half of people seem to want to run some sort of ally alongside them. Finally for the Eldar, we have the Inari. Again, they're a bit of a weird one. There's no out-and-out reason just to run them pure with no allies, and they are kind of an allied faction in themselves, allowing you to mix and match units from multiple different codexes. If you are running them in their own right, they give a melee boost to Eldar units, +1 to hit on the first round of the fight phase, and fight first if they charge, and out of their 3 unique models, both the Incarn and Ivrain are both quite usable. I think perhaps the best use of them at the moment is to add either the Incarn or Ivrain to a Harlequins or Craftworld list where it makes sense, or maybe if you are running some allied Drukhari to a list, perhaps you could think about running them as Inari. You've already lost power from pain, so maybe sometimes that melee buff might be worth it. In general though, I do feel Inari are a little bit niche. The Genestealer Cults again don't have any whole reason to run pure, and they've got some slightly interesting allied rules where they can ally with both Tyranids and have up to 1 detachment of guard for each Genestealer Cult detachment that you have in your army. Perhaps one incentive to avoid too many allies is that they're quite CP hungry. A lot of their best tricks require some really quite intensive stratagems, so I guess that's one incentive not to spend too many command points on allies. If you are bringing guard along, they must be taken as Brood Brothers, which just gives them a +1 leadership trait, but they don't get any of the other regimental traits, and they can't use their named characters. Sadly, I'd say that this means that guard are just a little bit less viable as allies for them. They can certainly bring their own interesting tricks, but for the most part you are playing guard with a bit of a downside to them, which is why I've more commonly seen Genestealer Cult lists allied to Tyranids. In any case, Genestealer Cults can bring some really powerful tricks to the table. Their Cult Ambush can give you a hard-hitting melee unit that just pops up right out of the enemy and makes a near-automatic charge, and you can have Obsec units pop up just 3 inches away from enemy models, stealing objectives from right under their noses. They've got some powerful buffing and synergy characters such as the Patriarch, which are often quite hard to deal with due to their Lookout Sir type rule, and they can also have some rugged and effective fire support in things like Achilles Ridge Runners and Goliath Rock Grinders. Generally though, the faction just really isn't all that strong as a whole. What they most need is just some efficient units that can hold the battle line, deal damage and receive it fairly well. Once that's in place, maybe they have a bit more room for doing all their tricks. Perhaps good choices could be Tyranid swarms, some solid melee critters such as Necrons, or fire support like Hive Guard and Exocrines. I think they might potentially pair quite well with the Death Riders of Krieg if you did want to convert them to your own Genestealer Cult ways. Overall, I'd say they're quite a powerful addition to a list, though aren't all that strong when they're run on their own. Next up we have the Tyranids. Again, no 9th edition codex, so no whole faction bonus for running pure, and they can ally only with Genestealer Cults or their own other sub-factions. As allies in their own right, they can bring some fairly efficient shooting, some hard-hitting melee, and some utility units like Ripper Swarms to a Genestealer Cult list, and as we said, just take the Genestealer Cult related options for Deep Strike from them. Obviously the Genestealers are a good option for them, and theoretically you can also have Tyranids and Guard in the same list as well, if you include a Tyranid detachment, a Genestealer Cult detachment, and some Brood Brother Guardsmen, leading to some weird and interesting combos. I'm not sure if it's really worth all the command point investment though that you'd need to make that possible. Within their own codex, I think it often could make sense to split the Hive fleet between a ranged one and an assault one, in particular having a detachment like Kronos for units like Exocrines and Hive Guard, as well as their nice anti-Psyker stratagem that they can bring, and then maybe have Hive Fleet Kraken, or perhaps a custom Hive Fleet for all the bugs that are going to be charging forward, maybe things like Genestealers, Swarm Lords, or powerful Forge World models. So lastly we come to the 3 Xenos factions that can only ally within their own codex and have no external allies at all, unless you're counting Spindle Drones and unaligned units, which I'm not. First up out of these we have the Tau Empire. Of course they have no out-of-faction allies themselves, which is interesting seeing as they're at least a bit more diplomatic than some of the other races. I guess for what it's worth they can field Kroot and Vespid units within the codex, though of course they're very limited. You certainly can divide Tau up depending on their detachments and their role. For example, at least in 8th edition, a lot of people tended to use the Sakir Sept to use Markalites and Firesight Marksmen to give them all rerolls to hit. It is perhaps a bit more questionable though, now that's going to cost you command points. Perhaps a better option might be to splash in some Farsight Enclaves to a main Tau army list to give you a big unit of Ballistic Skill 3 battlesuits and maybe some rerolls for getting close. If you're using quite a lot of any one given unit, there are some of the custom Septs which can amp them up, such as the one that makes burst cannons a bit better, or the hardened warheads one that gives you the improved AP on the missile systems. For the Necrons, I find it interesting that as they've had their 9th edition, they don't have any out-of-codex allies, and they're also at least a little bit restricted as to what sort of sub-factions you want to use as well. If you want command protocols, your entire army needs to be one sub-faction, aside from any dynastic agents, and the Silent King does count as that, so you can add him to say Novok and still get command protocols. For me though, command protocols are a bit take or leave. They're not exactly the biggest and most important buffs ever, and they're at least somewhat annoying to have to try and coordinate on the table, as you have to escort units around with characters everywhere. I think there's certainly viability for mixing it up between different dynasties, and just taking the damage buffs and forgetting about command protocols altogether. If we were keeping command protocols though, the Silent King can be handy with some of the individual dynasties. If you include him in a Supreme Command attachment in a Novok list for example, you could get 2 turns of the Protocol of the Hungry Boys. Otherwise though, you could mix and match things like the Obsec pre-game move custom dynasty, and maybe a different damage dealing one. Perhaps if the rest of your army is very melee focused, you could add in Novok, or maybe if you've got a fairly shooting Necron list, you could think about something like Mefrit. Finally, last but by no means least, we come to the Orks. Again, no out-of-codex allies, and their sub-faction use isn't restricted in the same way as the Necrons. There's every chance that this might change in the upcoming codex in a similar way to the Necrons. I guess we can only wait and see. In general, the most powerful detachments for an Ork core tend to be things like Goths or Death Skulls at the moment, it seems. Though depending on the army, it often makes sense to break up a few different units into their own separate detachment, as it can potentially make them quite a lot better. For example, if you have a bunch of mech guns, you could think about putting them in a drop mobs detachment. Getting them some rerolls and a free invul save really isn't too bad for a command point or two. Death Skulls could be pretty handy for any multiple small units orcs, things like Megatrak Scrapjeds or Dreadnoughts with custom Mega Blasters, and it could be good for small units like Commandos, as Death Skull infantry models gain Obsec. Evil Sons could be an interesting choice for anything aiming to deal damage out of Deep Strike, as they get their boosted charges, and you could always have a Goths contingent maybe for a bit more of a core of the army, particularly if you're running alongside a Ghazghkull. Overall, I think that Orcs are definitely an army that you can certainly either run with a mix of detachments or with just one. So that finally brings us to the end of the list. Hope you've enjoyed a bit of a discussion of every faction in 40k and how they might work either with allies or as allies. I'm sure I've missed bits and bobs here and there. Feel free to let me know anything that you can think about for your own faction down in the comments. If you've enjoyed the video and you'd like to see more like it, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly try and keep the 40k things coming out pretty much every day, or just check back later for more videos. Finally, if you have been getting some good value entertainment from the channel, I would just like to mention the channel's Patreon page, which is what keeps it going. Making all of these videos does take a ton of time, so if you are enjoying fairly regularly, any support is massively appreciated. Channel patrons get a fair few advantages, such as seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things should happen next, and automatic entry to the regular prize giveaways that happen at the start of each month with a chance to win some big model kits. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.